Often, when people think about large empires, they're assessed on a much wider scale. Was Rome good? Was Rome bad? It's quite hard to judge because there were so many different interactions between the empire itself and the peoples that it ruled. And that's why I think it's slightly easier to cover just one part of the empire today. And that is Britannia, the province of Britannia, which is modern day England and Wales. And obviously, interactions with different areas of the empire meant that the relationship between the Roman ruling class and the wider population differed by area and province. And I'll be focusing in on the province of Britannia today, as I said, and judging whether Roman presence there had a good impact on the native population of Britons living there. Just something interesting about looking into this topic. Before this, I'd never really questioned Roman rule here before. I remember growing up in a British primary school when I learnt about this, and I never really questioned the morality of the Roman Empire, the good or the evil. I only really accepted what happened as a fact. I suppose it didn't have any real impact on me as a person living hundreds of years after the Roman Empire actually existed. But having read some books on the topic of Roman Britain, I came across the theory that Victorian imperialists portrayed Rome as good to justify their own empire. And anyone who's done any kind of source work should have their alarm bells ringing now, because that does not shout unbiased interpretation. But that's just a side note. That could be a completely different video topic another day. There's going to be 4 factors that I use to assess this. Obviously, there's a lot more detail that one could go into. What was the interaction between the Roman military and the people in the province like? Well, that's quite necessary for seeing whether the Britons were aided or hindered by the Romans. Then Romanization. And Romanization is the process by which the Roman culture spread out to its more colonial provinces, where local peoples would incorporate Roman customs into their own cultures. And this is interesting because it's a large change caused by the Romans, and so gathering whether the Britons were better off because of it is very important. Trade and the economy are also important because good trade links and a strong economy do tend to mean better lives. And, of course, the famous Roman infrastructure and whether or not the infrastructure built in Britannia was good for the Britons. Okay, so what is the bad part about the Roman military? Well, the Roman conquests were a big part of that. A lot of people aren't aware that the Romans actually invaded Britain twice. Once under the man himself, Julius Caesar, and the second, and actually successful time, under the Emperor Claudius. Needless to say, a lot of Britons died. An example of this would be where an entire tribe was completely murdered in southern Wales. This tribe was called the Silures. Plenty of land was also stolen by the Romans, and entire tribes were kicked out of their homes. One such tribe being called the Trinovantes. There were also uprisings by Britons, which were brutally crushed by the Romans. The most famous example of this is Boudicca. One reason given for this rebellion, which is quite funny actually, was that a Roman guy called Seneca, decides to forcefully loan 40 million sesterces. This would be a Roman currency to some Britons to make some cash. And the Britons obviously can't pay back this vast sum, so they rebel. And a lot of Britons get killed and their land is destroyed. So why might the Roman military actually be good? Well, the Brittonic tribes that collaborated with Rome, the Romans wouldn't actually have been able to subjugate the province without the help of these British tribes. Lots of tribes, especially in the south, helped the Romans to house their troops and gave them supplies whilst they prepared to strike northward. These tribes were often repaid by the Romans in a kind of mutually beneficial agreement. One example would be the tribe of the Brigantes. Their queen gets dethroned in a civil war and is later on reinstalled by the Romans. And the Romans help her because she'd helped them previously. Having a tribal really to rely on was very beneficial for keeping the province in line and governable for the Romans. There was also a soldier administration. Britannia would not have been able to be ruled properly without its Roman soldiers. They acted as administrators, builders, policemen, and tax collectors. And it allowed Britain to become properly integrated into the Roman Empire, and therefore receive the benefits of being part of that Roman Empire as an entity. Now we'll look at Romanization. Romanization, once again, is the process through which Roman culture infiltrated the native cultures in the foreign provinces. Basically, the people in those provinces became slightly more Roman. First, we should really establish whether Romanisation actually occurred. And yeah, I can answer you, it did. The Romans built plenty of Roman buildings in towns that helped to introduce and entice Britons into adopting Roman culture. The actual Britannic elites themselves started to wear togas and speak Latin pretty quickly after the Roman conquest. Romanised client kings may also have been the reason why there aren't as many recorded rebellions as might be expected, because they were keeping their own populations in line. There are also plenty of Roman place names throughout the province, which are either Latinized versions of the Celtic root or just completely new settlements. So why might Romanisation have been good? Well, bath culture. Bathhouses were social places as well as places to be healthy and clean, and this was an integral part of becoming more Roman. And being more Roman as a culture also meant that the Britons were able to relate more deeply to people all across the Roman Empire. But why might Romanisation have been bad? Well, the Britons were no longer as represented in government under Roman rule as they had been before, since they weren't kind of accustomed to the new method of Roman governance. Celtic religion also suffered incredibly. The Roman pantheon seems to have adopted some local gods of the Britons, such as Sulis Minerva, originating from the area of modern-day Bath, but this does not change the fact that the Romans completely massacred the Britannic religious leaders called the Druids, and yeah, the Britons were just left without any of their own native religious leaders. Now let's move on to the economy. Being connected to the rest of the empire economically was not good when the empire was in a period of instability. Late on in the Roman Empire, the many civil wars helped to devalue the Roman coinage so much that it became basically worthless. And though this was only the case for some short years before the Romans left, coinage does also completely stop coming to Britannia just under a decade before the Romans officially withdraw from the province. And this shows that the economic situation in the province of Britannia does become perilous when the empire is in turmoil as a whole, even if this instability does not stem or even affect the population of Britannia otherwise. But the economy was also very good. The Romans introduced regular coinage, and this helps the province to trade more easily with the rest of the empire. And yeah, so trading links are established, and lots of cool and exotic goods are being imported to Britannia like never before. We see lots of imports of wine, olive oil, and fish sauce. Britannia can also export its lead to the empire, as the lead found in the province of Britannia was often of better quality and more easily extractable than other areas of the empire. Agricultural production also boosted under the Romans, with large arable land expansion efforts occurring in Kent and the Fens, looking to cut down forests and expose farmlands beneath. And as a result of this, actually, the population in Britannia grows substantially between the 2nd and 5th centuries. And by the 4th century, Britannia is seen as one of the most prosperous provinces of the empire. Now, let's look at the famous Roman infrastructure. You might be asking yourself, how could infrastructure be bad? Well, it's lucky I'm here to tell you. Roads were built to help move large armies around the province to suppress the populace. That was actually their original function. The Roman forts they built helped to protect these Roman armies and offered them a place to shelter and resupply. And actually, Roman towns in themselves weren't built to be bad, but they became quite dangerous in the late period of Roman Britain, since raiders from across the sea and from across the border with the Scots became a larger threat to an area of such a concentration of wealth, which were Roman towns. So infrastructure was also very good. Roads meant that goods could move around quickly and stimulated a lot of economic activity. And these roads were also the foundation of many Roman towns. Roman forts also spawned many Roman towns, and these forts helped to protect the towns from raiders. And actually, the towns promoted peace and provided public houses and personal housing, as well as becoming the economic heartbeat of the province, because this was where goods were traded, and this was also where a lot of the wealth of the province would be accumulating. So in conclusion, I think that the quality of life while under Roman rule was mostly better. The average person was probably better off and the productivity of the province of Britannia just skyrocketed, as did its trade with the continent. That's not to say that trade with the continent didn't exist before the Romans conquered Britain, but it was much easier to trade with places that were part of the same political entity as you. And the Britons, at least before the Roman Empire was a stumbling shell of itself, could rely on one of the best militaries in the world for protection. However, the main cost this had for the Britons was that their culture suffered, and their religious leaders were completely wiped out, and they picked up a lot more Roman customs. So depending on how you look at it, the conclusion changes. Either it was bad because the Britons couldn't maintain their own culture, or it was good because they were economically better off. Anyways, if you like the video, please give it a like, subscribe to see more content, and I will see you in the next one.